welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. Service on Celluloid is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Herstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Patton, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. And our special guests for today's episode are social media specialist here at the museum, Dave Walker.
Thanks for having me back, you magnificent bastard.
And Dan Olmsted, research historian at the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy.
Thank you for inviting me back, Seth.
And last but certainly not least, Tommy Lofton, director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum.
Hey guys, thanks for having me back.
Today we'll be discussing the 1970 film Patton. This epic biopic focuses on the World War II years of famous American General George S. Patton, Jr. The film picks up as General Patton takes command of U.S. Second Corps in North Africa following its humiliating defeat at the Kasserine Pass. The film follows Patton's military successes and some of his political failures throughout the war. Patton stars George C. Scott as the Venerable George S. Patton, Jr., Carl Malden as General Omar Bradley, Michael Bates, and Carl Michael Vogler. It was directed by Franklin Schaffner and written by Francis Ford Coppola and Edmund H. North. The film was both a financial and critical success, being nominated for 10 Academy Awards, winning 7, including Best Actor and Best Picture. So, as we always do, we're going to start off this film review by asking the question, how accurate is Patton? And Dave, you're sitting to the right of me, and I'll start with you.
Okay, fair enough. I'll let the historians talk about the battles, only because this is a classic mid-century Hollywood product. It took almost 20 years to make. In that way, it had multiple screenwriters and several different leading men at different times, several directors. How anything ever ends up being what Patton is, which I think in public memory is how people think of George Patton. Maybe not World War II historians, but most of the public who were alive and saw this film on screen at the time that it was out. As far as the battles go, I couldn't tell you. I think there are a couple of incredible battle sequences, and because of the nature of how the film got made, they shot it in Spain, and as it happened, the Spanish army had some fairly accurate material. But I'll pass on to our other speakers about the historical accuracy up and down.
Well, Tommy, let's hear from you. What about, in your opinion, how accurate is the movie?
Well, I think when you look back at who some of the options were, like Dave just said, it took almost 20 years to make the film. I think at one time they were even considering the Duke potentially playing Patton or a few other individuals. I think George C. Scott, first of all, was probably one of the best choices they could have made for Patton. I know he was kind of on again, off again throughout some of the original design process of the film, and then, eventually signed on, obviously, and became Patton. And I think Dave's right, too. I mean, there's a lot of public memory, and I would say even with World War II veterans, I think they tie a lot of that to the film more so than even what they saw of Patton, if they were lucky enough to see him during the war. I think it's actually, a pretty accurate film when you get away from, as Dave mentioned, they filmed it in Spain. By that point enough time had passed, enough World War II materials were harder to find. There weren't that many Sherman tanks sitting in Spain. They were having to use M46, M47, M48 tanks. And that's, when you look back at that, that's kind of a glaring, I don't want to say error, because they were doing the best with what they had, but an error in the sense of history. Those are tanks that came out in the Cold War. Those are not something you would have seen. They're much bigger than what you would have seen in combat in World War II for most of your American tanks. So there are some elements to the battles. I think, Patton is a complicated figure anyway from a history sense, but also in the film, and I think George C. Scott did a good job with that. There were some Hollywood moments, and I think there's probably some times, too, where they, in order to keep their PG rating, maybe watered down even some of the language that Patton might have used in certain instances. And actually, we know that. I mean, we know in some of the speeches and other moments in there they did have to water down a little bit of the language. But overall, yeah, I think it's a pretty accurate film.
You know?
Yeah, overall, I would agree with my two colleagues that I thought it was an accurate film. There are some discrepancies throughout the movie. The lack of original World War II equipment is really no fault of the producers of the movie. They approached the Army and actually tried to get, equipment that was genuine, but they weren't willing to help with that, so they had to use Spanish equipment. A few inaccuracies that Hollywood takes, obviously, just to compile everything into the time element. George C. Scott, though, actually becomes Patton, in my opinion. That is a very accurate portrayal that he puts on the big screen for 3 hours of creating the character of Patton. So overall, I think it's a pretty accurate film, but there are a few discrepancies. As already mentioned, some of the war scenes, the battle scenes, leave something to be desired. But on the whole, it's an accurate film.
Yeah, the battle scenes are sanitized for sure, but it's not a movie that focuses on battles. It's a biopic. It focuses on one individual, really. And I would agree with everybody at the table that when they said that George C. Scott became Patton, because he did. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the public's so-called quote-unquote memory of General George S. Patton Jr. is based off of George C. Scott.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, because George C. Scott has this very gravelly voice, and he sounds like that, whereas General Patton did not. He had a very high-pitched nasal voice. And if you actually hear a recording of George Patton, you're like, that's not Patton. It's like, no, yeah, it is.
And I think I saw, years ago, it may have been one of his family members, someone mentioned that they thought that George C. Scott was the Patton that Patton wanted to be.
Very possible.
And that's always sort of stuck with me in thinking about this film and about the character of Patton versus the reality.
I'll say this about the portrayal. The family fought this film. The reason it didn't get made from 1951 until 1969, in large case, was that the family resisted and fought all along. The family loved it once they got to see George C. Scott and how the general was portrayed. They strongly endorsed it by the end, and that just speaks to the quality of the performance.
I think to most Americans, when they visualize George Patton, they think of George C. Scott. George C. Scott, on like very few roles I can think of, consumes the character that he's playing. He becomes Patton. And today when we think of Patton, in a lot of people's minds, they see the actor George C. Scott as General Patton.
They hear his voice. They hear George C. Scott's voice instead of
right.
George S. his voice. But speaking of the portrayal of Patton, he was a very complicated, unique individual, shall we say. He's not your typical U.S. Army general. In the movie they show this quite often, at least 4 or 5 times, but his belief in reincarnation and things like that. He was known to be, or could be, abusive both physically and verbally, I guess is the best way to put it. How do you guys think that the movie stacks up with? And I mean, and those things are accurate. I mean, he did believe in reincarnation. He used profanity, well, like I do, and he was very good at it, like I am. But those things that they showed in the movie are accurate, in my opinion. Anyway, what do you guys think? What you know about the real Patton?
I think the character of Patton, there's a big contrast made in the movie. I mean, there's the scene in Sicily in which he's pinning the Purple Heart and saying a prayer with the wounded soldiers, but yet then he walks outside 5 minutes later and he's slapping the soldier. I mean, there's a big contradiction there. For the audience to watch it, they're like, they can pick up which Patton they believe in. Just like when he makes his famous speech at the very beginning, which actually never happened. That's parts and composites of other speeches that Patton made. He talks about the great honor of American soldiers, but yet we're going to pull the guts out of these Germans. So you can, the audience watching it can zero in what Patton they believe is the correct Patton. It's a big contradiction in the character throughout the movie. You see those type of things.
Well, actually on the speech, and if I'm wrong, somebody correct me, but I think it did happen. It did not happen in that order, but it actually happened on the night of June 5th, 1944, as he's speaking to Third Army.
Yeah, it was a Third Army speech, and then the way it was actually set
it wasn't in 1942 like it showed in the movie.
Right. And he didn't wear his chest full of medals either. That was just the flashiness for the film. Right. The
big flag
wasn't
wasn't
the
there.
introduction. Yeah, that was all. I think there's only maybe one instance. There's a photo of him, not a painting, but a photograph of him with all of his medals on at his wife's request. I think it was in their backyard or something to that effect. But he really didn't, it's not like he carried those around or had an aide carry them around the entire war, and he just put them on when he needed to rally the troops. But and there's multiple occasions where you see Patton do that, even from North Africa on, where he's speaking to units, and then, you brought up the reference, Dan, to slapping the soldier. It was actually two separate soldiers.
That's
that
right.
He,
and I believe one of them
hit.
actually was suffering from malaria.
One is believed to, have been suffering from malaria at the time, and he ended up, as you see in the movie, he did have to go make an apology. He actually made multiple apologies, and had to, try to save a little bit of grace, I guess, in a sense, or save face. Excuse me. I think that's a interesting thing about him. Like you say, there's you see where he loves his soldiers in 1 minute, and then the next minute he's knocking them around in a sense. And I think he's a very complicated general. I mean, he's going to do what it takes to get things done, come hell or high water.
Right.
But I think he knew where the limits were, and sometimes wasn't afraid to cross over those. And I think that's what hurt him in a lot of ways. And you see after that incident too, especially, he doesn't really take part in the Normandy invasion, and he has to pay a price in a sense for that. And I think the other interesting thing about him is he's comes from an aristocratic family. He was wealthy. He'd been very Olympian.
Too,
very well educated, very poetic. It wasn't just the sense of reincarnation with him. Everything he had seemed to revolve around poetry or around books, literature. He was a very well-read man. He was very very well educated, very sharp. I think he's very unique and different when you compare him to a lot of other generals like Bradley or even Eisenhower in some ways too.
He was a throwback in my opinion. Even in the when he graduated from the military academy in 1909, he was even a throwback then. He's something that kind of reminds me of some kind of a Napoleonic soldier.
Or like a Renaissance man almost.
Yeah.
Because he's good in doing a lot of different manly type of things. He competed in the Olympics in 1912. He was a man of letters, as Tommy mentioned. He kept a diary. A very contradicting figure. I want to mention one thing too, because you brought up the reincarnation thing. Which I find absolutely fascinating because it kind of makes him part of history in a sense. Mm-hmm. He constantly refers to, well, I was at Carthage and, I was with Napoleon and what have you. So it puts him outside of the events that are taking place almost like, I'm bigger than all this. And I've been part of history and I'm going to be part of history as it moves forward. And then to be put on the sidelines, well, that's just absolutely terrible.
Right. Well, we started talking about the speech a little bit in the beginning of the movie, and it's probably one of the most iconic scenes in the movie, and frankly in American cinema. I mean, if you see a looping reel of iconic scenes of movies from the Squaw Man, one of the first movies until whatever's at the theater now, that scene,
Mary Poppins,
without
even
a doubt,
quick snap is there. That him standing there in front of that flag. Is an iconic scene. Now, as we said, that the whole flag thing didn't happen and all that jazz. But the speech that he makes in the beginning of the film is actually based off of that Third Army speech, and it's sanitized because you can look it up if you look up Patton's Third Army speech. That's all you got to do, and it's there. And there's a lot of profanity in there. We talked about how cultured and what a gentleman he sometimes portrayed himself to be, but he could cuss like a sailor. And that's something that was kind of interesting. We were talking about a little bit before is that he chose to use profanity when it was most effective for the purpose in which he was trying to achieve. So if he was talking to his soldiers, he talked to them like a soldier.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
But if he was talking to a group of English ladies who were having tea, he spoke to them like he was speaking to a group of English ladies having tea. So he used it in a very poetic way.
I want to one thing about that opening scene. It's interesting too that initially was not going to be kept in the movie.
Right. Yeah.
And
he didn't want to do it. George C. Scott didn't want to do it.
Right. And then in the end, it gets put in, and yet we think of that as probably one of the most iconic moments of the movie.
Yeah. But it is actually pretty close to what he actually said. It's a little out of sequence.
Yeah,
That's what I was referring to.
Yeah.
And it's shortened, and
Oh,
and the other thing about, well, not just that speech, but with his profanity. I always found it interesting with interviewing veterans over the years. It could be very off-putting to a lot of folks too. I mean, some respected him maybe as his general, maybe for his rank and as a commander and all. But when you think of some of the soldiers, they don't come from certain parts. They may come from very religious backgrounds and very religious families. They're not used to having their leaders stand up in front of them and just blurt out four-letter words after four-letter words. And that, I know a number of veterans over the years that, again, maybe had some respect for him, but also didn't have a lot of respect for him because of how he could treat his troops or how he spoke, or especially after the slapping incident and that kind of thing.
I wanted to ask the guys who've done oral histories, which is all of you, because it seems to me I've read and seen that he was a polarizing character. There are men who loved him, but there are other men. I don't know. I read Andy Rooney's book about the war, and Rooney didn't care for him and dealt with him quite a bit, covering for UPI or whatever the service was. And that's an interesting thing about his character. It's like he wasn't the statue during the war. People absorbed him in different ways.
Yeah, there was a love-hate relationship with his men and himself. Absolutely.
Oh yeah. I mean, and that's, you're 100% right, Dave. And that he was polarizing, and there were people that served under him that absolutely adored him and absolutely detested him at the same time. Yeah. And the reasons for that are many. I mean, they loved him because he was a charismatic guy. I mean, if you ever read anything that he actually wrote or you ever actually hear him speak with his high-pitched voice, he's just one of those guys that when you hear him talk, you're like, damn, I want to do something for this guy. I want to help this guy out. He's one of those guys,
And with him, when he said he was going to do something,
he did it.
He did it. There was no stopping him. It didn't matter what it took, even if it meant a lot of human lives. He was going to do what he said he was going to do. And so I think a lot of people knew that they could put a lot of weight in what he was saying. Seemed to me a lot of the guys that I ever had the chance to interview that fought in North Africa or maybe Sicily, they seemed to be the ones in my mind that didn't care for him as much, because he was very much stop in the middle of the road and, hey, soldier, why don't you have your tie on? Or he was very much about their appearance, their uniform, looking like a soldier. And you see some of that in the film where he's walking around as soon as he takes command of the Second Corps. He's walking in and getting on to soldiers for how they look, why they haven't shaved, where's your weapon, where's your helmet. And, that, I think there's a lot of truth to that with veterans that I met. A lot of them respected the fact that they felt like he was maybe a better leader after what they had been through at Kasserine and earlier battles within North Africa. But overall, they didn't like the guy. And I think it wasn't until maybe
it was when he took Third Army.
Yeah, Third Army, and for his actions at Bastogne, I think sort of
absolutely
changed the minds of some veterans or gained him a little bit more popularity.
They were Third Army was splashed all over the headlines. Yeah. All the time, and part of that was because of Georgie Patton, but it was also because they were moving. They were kicking some behind.
The territory the Third Army gobbles up once they get in Europe is phenomenal in the annals of history. No army has moved as fast, claimed as many people, as many casualties, prisoners, captured as many villages, and Patton is kind of the hero for that because he seeks out the publicity. The other generals don't seek out publicity. You don't see Bradley wanting publicity. I mean, Patton's unique in that sense that he wants to be on the cover of Stars and Stripes.
And to your point, Tommy and Dave, one reason that he was not liked also, and you just said it, he would do whatever he had to do to get the job done despite the cost in human lives. In his view, it was going to cost less lives to get the war over faster than it would be to drag it out, to try and avoid losses. Let's just run right through that wall right now. Yeah, I know somebody's going to get hurt, but we're going to take that position and we're going to get it right now instead of doing it 2 days from now.
And you see it in the film, too. He's not a politician. He's not a soldier politician. Right. He is a soldier. He would rather die on the battlefield than ever think about holding a public or political office. And he even references that. And I think that sets him apart from some of the general staff as well during the war. He has no political ambitions. He doesn't care. He has a war to fight. He wants to win that war. And unfortunately, sometimes he went a little over the top with how he did that. But at the same time, I think Eisenhower and a lot of others looked at that like, this is great. We can use this. The Germans are maybe scared of him, or they're constantly wanting to know where Patton is. The Ghost Army, we can get into that a little bit too, and how it did play a little bit into our favor, getting into D-Day and all of that. But he definitely is a powerful figure, and ironically, we talk about it in the film, or we talked about it in the film earlier, that the tanks were inaccurate. The M46, the M47, and M48 are the most common tanks used in this film by Spain. Don't know if y'all are aware of this. They're all called the Patton. The M46 Patton, the M47 Patton, the M48 Patton.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of cool in a sense that while they are inaccurate for the film, most every tank you see in there, not every, but most every tank you see is a Patton variant tank. And, you know.
And wouldn't Patton have loved that?
Oh, yeah.
God, yeah. Oh, I mean, he helped design the United States Army's tank corps.
Right.
You know,
Right.
he was in the very first large-scale armored battle that the U.S. Army ever fought in.
He was
in World War I.
He was in the first war ever fought that was mechanized.
Right.
Chasing after Pancho Villa.
Yep.
Well, even back then, he started creating controversy because he led a raid that killed 3 people, and he put the bodies on the hood of his car.
Yeah, he was an electric guy. 81,522 square miles of territory, by the way.
There you go.
The Third Army liberated, or the best word, conquered.
Right.
But let's move on a little bit. The portrayal of the generals in the movie, Patton obviously is one, and General Bradley and General Montgomery, how accurate is that? And we've talked about Patton, so let's skip over him in this regard, and let's move on to briefly, very, very briefly, because the movie is about George Patton. Let's talk about Montgomery and General Bradley.
I thought that Michael Bates, who they found to play Montgomery, could have walked off the set of Monty Python's Flying Circus, which was actually the first season of which was being filmed at the same time as Patton. So this isn't that much of a stretch, but I thought it was almost a cartoonish depiction that was, like, to me, one of the like the flatter notes of the film. He's there in that way to make a point. But the character comes off almost as much of a villain as Rommel.
Yeah.
You know, Rommel's got a little bit more of a heroic stature in the film than Montgomery, and that is one of the little things that trouble me. But I don't know that much about the real Montgomery or those relationships.
Well, and I think you're right, Dave, that Montgomery in this movie, it's almost silly. It seems to be that most of what they use in the film is this competition thing between he and Patton, and there was some, but and then you see even in the film they created a scene where Patton and Monty link up, and there's some bragging in a sense going on there that never happened. I mean, that was Hollywood, but to me they could have done a little bit better job with Montgomery and make him a little more of a serious soldier, a serious commander, and a little less just cheesy, anti-Patton competition in a sense. Bradley, I thought, was actually pretty well done, and it probably helps that he was an advisor to the film, and part of the script was based on his own works. I thought Carl Malden actually did a pretty good job because you see him as the soldier's commander that he really was.
Soldier.
I mean, he's a soldier's soldier. He's a soldier's leader. He was very much about his men, very much more, I would say, cautious than Patton and more respectful towards his soldiers and others. And then, of course, eventually you see that the roles reverse and the tables turn a little bit. You start the movie with Patton being his superior, and then before it's all said and done there, Bradley's in charge of Patton and trying to rein him in as best he can and still achieve success in the war. I felt like overall, of Bradley versus Montgomery, I felt like they did a little bit better job with Bradley. Probably could have done better with Montgomery.
Yeah, I thought both the characters were rather weak, actually. In fact, that's one of the few criticisms I have of the movie is the character development of the characters in the movie outside of Patton. In fact, Carl Malden at times playing Bradley, I think his main role is just to stand around and look at George Patton and for George Patton to have someone to sound off on. There's really no deep, soul-searching of what Bradley stood for and who Bradley was. Tommy's absolutely right, though. His memoirs from the war played a crucial part in the development of the film. I agree with Dave 100% on Montgomery. And he seemed kind of, they could have done a lot more with his character as well also.
He was satirical.
Yeah.
Really.
I found there's a great book about the making of this movie by Nicholas Evan Sarantakis, and I found this and loved it, and I highly recommend it if you like Patton because he found studio memos and personal diaries, and at one point during the production, either the script or a cut made it over to the 20th Century Fox attorney in England. They were worried about the international market, and the attorney said that the depiction of Montgomery was actionable defamation. It is such a cartoonish portrayal, and I agree with you guys. It sort of
Yeah, I mean, he was a British hero, too.
Yeah, he was.
Well, they had to have a hero also, right?
Yeah, they do. And I mean, Montgomery had his good points, and we're not here to talk about him or not. But he had his good points, but he certainly had his faults as well. Speaking of faults, George S. Patton Jr. had many, and in the movie that you don't really, aside from the slapping incident, and aside from when he's at the luncheon for the English ladies, and he doesn't mention the Soviet Union, and then at the end of the movie when he insults the Russian general, or the Soviet general rather, they don't really talk about any of his setbacks, and he had quite a few. I mean, he wasn't perfect, I mean, he didn't win all the time. Why do you think that they didn't? I mean, if this is a biopic and it's supposed to be real, it's supposed to be as honest as we can be, within a limited amount of time, why don't you think they addressed anything other than the political setbacks that he did have? Because he did have some military setbacks too.
I think some of it is that if they went too far with it, you had to worry that the family, it's already taken almost 20 years to get this film made. Everybody is going to expect to see something about soldiers getting slapped because that was all over Stars and Stripes. That was all over the place in the media in the 1940s. So you know of a few instances that everybody's familiar with that have to be in this film. To go too far beyond that will take away a little bit from the hero of Patton in the film. But then again, like Dave was saying earlier, I mean, the family finally signed off on this film and finally liked it. I think if you went too far, they were going to do what they could to keep this from being made. Yeah. That's just a guess on my part.
It's probably very accurate too. What about you, Dave? What do you think?
I think I wonder if Bradley's role had something to do with the military and tactical errors or shortfalls. I wonder if that had something to do with it too. I honestly don't know that much about George Patton. As you guys have been talking about him, I keep thinking of saying something about George C. Scott because he was an equally troubled guy.
Very much so.
I'll hold off on that, but you guys know the history better and Patton's flaws. Why they would leave it out of a movie? This was a biopic that was intended to create a legend, and even though Patton in the war was still within the memory of many millions of people, the producer and director, who both were in World War II, the producer was on Marshall's staff, met all of these characters, including Patton. I think he wanted to do an accurate history of the person, but also I think he felt some possession of a legacy. And I think that why you would stay with a project for 20 years and then maybe not have it become what it was. I don't know. That's my thought.
How about you, Dano?
Oh, I agree with everything that Tommy and Dave said. And one other thing, too, would be that time restraint. I mean, you've got 3 hours. And as it is, the movie is long, 3 hours, although it goes really quickly for a 3-hour movie. You can only depict so many scenes and so many episodes and so many events in a person's life. So the slapping scene, which has already been mentioned here, was on the front page of Stars and Stripes. So that was something you could put on the big screen and people, oh, yeah, that's right, he did that. Oh, golly, that wasn't good. That's something people were familiar with. If you start digging into everything else, you're going to be, time's going to be an issue to depict all that on the screen. So I think in a sense, it's the time restraints, and Hollywood took the liberty of picking what they thought, the general audience would respond to.
I think there's, excuse me, something possibly too to the fact that he didn't come home from the war. I mean, the war was over for basically by the time he passed. But think about how many of these other generals made it home. He didn't make it home from the war. I just kind of feel like they had to kind of hero worship a little bit for him because to sit there and beat up on the dead general who probably could have been a major figure for us in the Korean War, maybe even into Vietnam, which, by the way, is still going on as this movie is being made and shown. And that's the other thing I wonder, too, is maybe they didn't want to make him too much of a villain because we still needed a hero at that time. We're at a point where America's starting to turn against its own military and against its own structure with the Vietnam War and everything else. I kind of wonder if Bradley and others looked at it and said, here's a chance for us to bring back a little bit of patriotism back into the country and remind ourselves of where we were just a few years ago. That's, again, just a kind of a guess on my part when you think about the context of when the film was finally made and the decision of keeping the family behind it.
Well, now that you mention it, let's talk about this. How does the film was made in '69, was released in '70. How does the film reflect the time or the era in which it came out? I mean,
1970, of course.
this is the Nam.
Yeah, I mean, we're 2 years out of Tet Offensive in 1970. I mean, things are not looking good. Making of this movie and releasing it in 1970, as I think Tommy just mentioned, it shows a pro-military point of view when the people in the streets are protesting the war. But let's remember what happened 25 years ago, and here's an American hero. So you need a hero. You need something supporting the military, and this is a pro-military film all the way. And it is really kind of ripe that it's released in 1970 when everybody in the streets anti-military and screaming about bringing everybody home. It's kind of a contradiction of what's actually happening inside the military.
Dave?
Yeah, there's an interesting conversation about when it was released and what the filmmakers thought about what they were saying with the film. The producer and writer, Edmund North, the other writer besides Francis Ford Coppola, both believed it was an anti-war film. The film was marketed as Patton as rebel, as iconoclast. And part of that was trying to make it a little squishy for the times. But if you think about it, he is portrayed in the film as someone who bucked the system and didn't always follow the letter of every order. Well, no, he followed all the orders, but I'm saying he was and
Did it his own way.
Yeah,
Well,
he did his own-
three-star generals don't have to follow the orders.
Yeah. And in fact, there was
Well,
there was marketing material put out that called it a portrait of a rebel, and some of the early reviews included that in the title. Which, if you think about it, and in those times, that's a sly kind of marketing thing. But I also think it's accurate. It's a way to sell the film, but I don't think it's deceiving people about it. You know, this is in one of the most turbulent years in turbulent decades. Kent State was the very next month. America was as divided about war and the war that was on then as it ever had been about any war. And the movie's pliable in that way where people, I think, take messages from it in different ways. The fact that the filmmakers, and I don't think this was like a pose, I think they really did see it as an anti-war movie.
Yes, I just don't see it as an anti-war movie at all. I
can see where you're coming from, where they were trying to get that out, but I just don't. I agree. I don't. This is not, to me. This makes me want to sign up. It doesn't make me want to go FTA. You know, I'm joining the Army.
The big giant American flag at the beginning of the film kind of helps me feel like it's a little more patriotic than maybe what they intended.
If you think about it, there were a lot of war movies that came out 68, 69, and 70. A lot of what we call classics today. You know, I mean, this one, Battle of Britain, Kelly's Heroes, Dirty Dozen, Where Eagles Dare. I mean, there's a ton of them that came out in that era.
Same year, Tora Tora Tora.
Tora Tora Tora.
And MASH. That's the era. That's the era where this film landed between those two. In some ways.
Yeah. You were going to say something, Dan. Go ahead.
I lost my train of thought. Let's move on.
Well, let's talk about George C. Scott. You know, we touched on it in the beginning, and you know how we visualize George S. Patton now when you think of George C. Scott. But how did his How was his performance, and how does it fit within his filmography? And I think Dave, you might be able to address this better than most.
Well, it's a different dimension altogether from Buck Turgidson, which is my other favorite George C. Scott performance. And he, was a stage actor who did film to support his stage habit. He was also a deeply troubled guy with a drinking problem that was so severe that it scared Carl Malden from drinking for the rest of his life. Patton. George C. Scott's, they lost 8 production days because of his drinking, and he was a very troubled guy who, in the background that I understand, started drinking heavily when He was finishing boot camp at the time the war ended, and finished his stint as burial detail at Arlington. And that's kind of when his troubles with that began. And he was also a fierce advocate for Patton through this film. He read a dozen-plus books. He tried to rewrite script sections on the set while he was doing it, and had definite opinions about the portrayal, and was a defender of who he understood to be the real Patton. And he was, he gave an interview during production where he was decrying how they were doing it. I think he was trying to get the production's attention. That said, and I think we all agree, it's an indelible performance, one of the great film performances of that era, and the one, other than Buck, I think the one he'll be remembered for.
Yeah, I mean, as biopics go, they can either be really good or they can be horrible. And I mean, and again, that's what this is. This is a biography of General George S. Patton Jr. in World War II, and as such, I think this is the best biopic ever made, certainly on any kind of military figure for sure. And there's been a lot of them, and it's mainly due to him. I mean, he was Patton. Yeah, he became George Patton.
And I like that he's able to really channel Patton, even beyond the opening speech. I mean, with the rough and gruff character, but then he can turn around, like Dan was saying earlier, and be the tender leader with the soldier who he was presenting the Purple Heart. The other thing that stands out in my mind, I believe he was a captain, his aide that was killed early in the film.
Right.
And you hear
Jensen, I think.
And that's all a true story, that he did die. That was a real character. And you have Patton, reading through the letter he sent home or something to that effect, and you see those tender moments in there. I think George Scott did a great job with showing the full dynamic of Patton in one direction or another. And again, I think I said it earlier, I don't know, as much as I love John Wayne, I don't know that he or any other kind of actor that they may have considered at one time or another for this film, Charlton Heston or whoever.
Burt Lancaster, I think, was
Burt
considered
Lancaster
too at one time.
I don't know that they could have pulled this off. I think this is the man born to play the role in a lot of ways.
And I mean, you mentioned his tenderness towards his troops, and we've been talking a lot about his rough, gruff attitude. And let's be real here. He loved his men.
Oh, most definitely.
He's buried overseas with his men.
Yeah, that's right.
He's not buried in the family plot in California. He's not buried at West Point or VMI or wherever. He's in the field with the men that he led. And that's a beautiful thing. And I mean, I cannot admit, whether he had any choice in that or not, but I can assure you that's where he would want to be. He loved those people. Mm-hmm. And to me, the coolest scene in the movie, my favorite scene in the movie, is not the opening scene. It's the scene where he's driving his people towards Bastogne. Oh, yeah. And he's standing there and he's watching these guys, and they are friggin' miserable. They're covered in blankets and they just look like a bunch of hobbits, they just look horrible. And he's just pushing them, and they're going, and they haven't had sleep for days, and they're going, and they're going, and they're going. And he just stands there and he's smiling and says, God, I'm proud of these men. Mm-hmm. And that's awesome. That was George Patton.
Yeah. And, and you see in a couple spots in there. I mean, there's the old blood and guts referenced several times.
Absolutely. Our blood, his guts.
Yeah. You do see that, but I think in the end, deep down, I do think he did care.
Absolutely, he did.
Whether some soldiers felt like he showed it right or not, it was there.
I mean, and you talked about the oral histories that we've all heard or done here at the museum, and I find it very hard to remember too many Third Army veterans who don't proudly say or didn't proudly say, I was in Patton's Third Army. It wasn't Third Army. It was Patton's Third Army.
Yeah, I had very few. I'm trying to think of the oral histories I conducted with Third Army veterans, and I can't really think of any. Say, I didn't want to serve with Patton. I didn't like serving with Patton. In fact, they usually went out of their way to say, yeah, I saw Patton here, or I was, I went through that intersection where he was directing traffic. They tried to find some way where they could put themselves in the presence of Patton. One comment about George C. Scott before we move on is when I watch this, I'm going, 12 Angry Men, which is one of my favorite movies. And he's like juror number 3 or number 4, I'm thinking. I don't remember exactly which one it was. But the roles he's played over the years, George C. Scott, have all been kind of like this, this very hard-nosed individual. And I think that Patton is kind of like the climax, the epigee of that when he takes on the role, when Scott takes on the role of Patton. There's a lot of similarities in their characters, as pointed out rightfully by Dave. And, I mean, this role was written for George C. Scott.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I want to take a minute to credit the script because it does have that whiplash between the sacred and the profane and captures that part. And that's really good script writing because that allows the actor to play the depth. And, credit to Francis Ford Coppola, who did most of the shooting script that I believe that they ended up doing, because that's what endears the character to the audience, even a 1970 audience. Here's a religious guy who believes in reincarnation, but who can be pointed with his language. He can use profanity like punctuation, like croutons, and that's great script writing to put all of that into one guy.
Do you read the Bible, General? Yes, I do. Every goddamn day.
And I believe in reincarnation, too.
Well, for a very long film, and it is long, it is surprisingly short on side plots, supporting characters, or human interest stories. And why do you think that is? And I'm going to take this one before everybody else is, because it's about George Patton.
It was this movie's the Third Army. It has one story to tell, and I think that's what you're getting at. It's like there's just it's not stopping for.
Right.
And notice they never even show Eisenhower. Eisenhower's a character in this film, and you see Patton walking out of Ike's office. You see or hear references to Ike constantly in this film. But I feel like to try to build, I don't know who would have played Eisenhower, but even if they found someone, that would have taken away from Patton. I think it had to be, like you say, about Patton. Yeah. You couldn't get too far away from the man, or it turns into a movie about the Battle of the Bulge or a movie about El Guitar or whatever. I think that's why you don't see as many side plots as you may in other films.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. The movie is about General Patton. Everyone else, to me, kind of just like stands around support. They are literally supporting actors. Yeah. They all just stand around supporting George C. Scott as he goes on with his role of General Patton. To get into side plots, to get into character development, would take away from the essence of the film, which is a biopic on George Patton. And the writers and the directors did a good job of staying the course with telling the story of George Patton.
Yep. And this is we'll get to that in a minute. But let me start moving around here before we get to what I was going to say. And Dan, I'll start with you. Did you like this movie, and would you recommend Patton?
It's interesting. I watched it over the holidays, and I hadn't seen it in years. And my wife watched it with me, actually. And when it was over, she goes, "Well, that's not a movie about war in the sense of like we were soldiers or battleground or anything like that." I'm thinking, yeah, really, it's not. There's very few battle scenes to speak of. You see these newsreels of Patton moving in his Third Army, moving across France, moving into Germany, which is really cool, seeing those newsreels. In that, is it a good film? Do I like? Yes, absolutely. It's very entertaining. It came up. I have the DVD. It said intermission. I'm like, what do we have an intermission for? I mean, let's just keep on going. I thought for 3 hours it just moved very fast. It kept my attention. Also, I think, as we've already mentioned here, it did an accurate job of telling the story of an American hero, General Patton. So would I recommend the movie? Most definitely, absolutely. You don't even have to be a military buff to want to appreciate this. It helps. But, if you just want a good picture on a great American, hey, I would suggest you watch Patton.
Tommy?
I would recommend this film. I think this is probably one of the best films, of American cinema in history. I think has one of the best character actors of all time playing a lead role of an individual who should be remembered in history. And it's, to me, again, we've talked a little bit about some of the inaccuracies and how long it was it took to make the film and lack of accuracy with tanks and other things. But if you get past or overlook all of that, there's some very powerful pieces in there, very powerful pieces important to understanding the man Patton, the leadership of Patton, and his successes and failures, if you will, in World War II. I would highly recommend this for anybody who's either a historian, budding historian, someone interested in American history, or just someone looking for a good movie, period. Whether you're into military movies or not, I still feel like this is probably one of the best films you could watch.
Dave?
I liked it when I first saw it in a theater with an intermission. And I was a kid, but it was a very stirring work of commercial art. There was an audience full of people who were moved. I think they cheered when it was over. I think just because of when it landed, I just think it had that impact on people. I rewatched it last week, and the Amazon version has an intermission, which is a real funny artifact. It was that way because it was a road show at first. It was only in limited theaters, and they wanted it to be a prestige release at first. And in rewatching it, some of these other, I didn't remember Montgomery's I wouldn't have understood Montgomery's portrayal when I first saw it. And what little I know now, it's a couple of those little characterization flaws troubled me a little bit, but I was still incredibly moved by the performance and also the craft of it, the script, and the execution of what is a complicated story about a complicated guy. And yeah, absolutely, I'd recommend it. And it's definitely in the canon. It's of great World War II movies.
Yep, I agree with everybody here. I like this movie. I always have. It's a very good movie. I think it's a very accurate representation of General George S. Patton. You know, in my career here, I've never been a top-down guy. I've never been a guy that follows generals or researches generals or what. I always wanted to know about the people who did the things, didn't tell people to do them, but who actually did them. And of all the American generals, admirals, whatever, George Patton is probably the one that I know the most about because of this film. Not because everything I know about George Patton came from this movie, but it inspired me or encouraged me to read George Patton's book, War as I Knew It, as a kid, to find out who was this badass, who was this guy. And he was. I mean, let's be honest, he was. He was a bad dude. And the movie itself is very heroic. It is very heroic. And as what I was going to say earlier, and I waited till now, the score in this movie. Mm-hmm. My God, that song. I mean, you want to get up and start marching when you hear that song. You know, you're just like, yeah. So, I mean, it's awesome. I love this movie. I like the battle scenes. Are they accurate to, like Saving Private Ryan style? Absolutely not. But, I mean, think of the scale. You know, the desert combat scene. It's shot from way back, and you see everything going on. You see the men running around. You see, from a general's point of view, he's not going to be in the lead tank.
Of course, they're pretty crowded. But.
Well, yeah, but you get what I'm driving at here. It's an orchestrated chaos, and it's I think it's pretty cool. Is it accurate? No, but is it cool? Yeah, it is. It's a pretty neat scene. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend this movie. I think it's pretty accurate when it comes to George Patton. It does portray the accurate events of World War II. I mean, from his taking over Second Corps until the end of the war. Are there things that it misses? Yeah. But like you said, Dan, it would be 7 hours long if we were to include everything that George Patton did or didn't do. So, yeah, I would absolutely recommend it. And can you sum it up in a final thought or two there, Dan?
I think it's interesting that the beginning of the movie, he's addressing the Third Army. And so we're talking, he's in front of literally thousands and thousands of people. And yet the movie concludes with him by himself walking Willie with no one else around. It shows a man who needs war, who needs the camaraderie of his men, because the final scene, to me, is kind of pathetic and lonely, walking his dog, Willie, and that's how it concludes. So that's...
He was a warrior.
Yeah.
He was a warrior. Tommy?
After almost getting hit by a cart of dung, too, by the way, which I love that comment where he says, after all of this, to get taken out by that. Well, and before I summarize this, we were talking about the tanks, the Patton tanks earlier, M46, M47, M48s. I do want to put in a little bit of a plug. If you get the chance to come to the World War II Museum, come see the Sherman tanks, which are accurate to what Patton would have been using, and Stewart's. If you get the chance, drive about 90 miles north to Camp Shelby, to the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. We also have a Sherman tank, but we also have an M47 Patton, an M48 Patton, and the M60 Patton, which came years later as well. So you'll get a chance to see a comparison of what Patton actually used versus what was used in the film and see some differences there. So,
You got any pictures on your website? What's the address?
well, actually, we're redoing our website right now. But if you
trying to help out here.
Yeah, no. If you
Marketing
Google
for
search
you.
our Mississippi Armed Forces Museum, you can find our website. We're also building up a bunch more on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram. So if you get the chance, look in the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum and come see us. To summarize this film, I think it's, again, one of the best biography films you could ever see of anybody. I mean, whether they're an American or otherwise. This is probably one of the most important films in Hollywood history. I think it's a must-watch for anybody and everybody interested in Hollywood, interested in film, in script writing, and editing. I mean, it's a film that anybody and everybody should watch, especially as Americans, not just for the history of it all and for who the individual is that's portrayed in the film, but for just how great this film is, especially after it took so long to finally come together and build into what it is now. And for the score, as you mentioned. I mean, to me, it's beautiful. I think it's a must-see film.
Dave?
I'll just say magnificent, because I think it accomplishes so much with a combination of script and cinematography, which we haven't really talked about, but this is in many places a beautiful movie. And then the portrayal, it ranks up there with all the great film biographies. So.
Yeah. And I'll have to add that Tommy's Museum is fantastic, so drive the 90 miles and go see it. And as I always do, I'm going to end this discussion with a quote, and it's not the profane quote that I was going to use, but this is a good one too, and it's at the end of the movie, and I think this summarizes George S. Patton Jr., the actual man in the movie, very, very well. And it goes, quote, "The conqueror rode in a triumphal chariot, the day's prisoners walking in chains before him. Sometimes his children, robed in white, stood with him in the chariot or rode the trace horses. A slave stood behind the conqueror, holding a golden crown and whispering in his ear a warning that all glory is fleeting." So thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, listen to our mini-episode next week where we will share oral histories from those who were there or who served with General George S. Patton. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Surface on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.